budget week. Lots to get through. Let's bring in the Australian's national editor, Dennis Shanahan, and Sky News contributor, Chris Uhlmann. Gents, welcome. Dennis, budget week, as I said, election to be called. I think that's the general consensus this weekend or earlier. We'll get into news poll in a moment, but high stakes tomorrow night for the Treasurer, isn't it? He's got to set up Labor's election platform. They're behind in the polls. We know there's red ink everywhere in the books we'll finally get to see. So are you expecting a vote-buying budget? And if so, will it work?
Well, it's certainly a vote-buying budget. There's no doubt about that. It's all spend. There's more than $60 billion since January has been promised. The coalition has basically matched much of it. A lot of it's directed into specific projects in electorates. And so what we're seeing is a big splurge, and we're not seeing any real attention being paid to paying down debt or to try and change the outlook of a decade of deficits. Now, vote buying might just very well work, given that both sides are doing it. And I think that what we'll probably see is not so much an election call before the end of this week or on the weekend, but probably the following weekend and even for a longer campaign, because Anthony Albanese wants time to sell his budget, as does Jim Chalmers, and he also wants more people to say from Peter Dutton, bring out your policies, just as you have, Peter, and this is putting pressure on Dutton and the coalition. So the budget could very well work for the Labor Party, although they're still on track to be a minority government.
Look, you make a good point too, because on the back of the budget, they've got all these excuses to spend taxpayers' money on government advertising. And I guess a longer campaign with their union donations, the third-party support in advertising, they can run it harder and longer than the coalition can, who doesn't have that union bankroll. Interesting, Chris, in the news poll today, you've still got a problem with Labor's primary vote. So any way you look at this bloke, the Prime Minister, is not likely to be able to govern in his own right. And I make the point that we're, historic primary there of 31% for Labor. Coalition, not yet with a 4 in front. That's where they need to be in terms to win, but a lot of bleed to minor parties there, independents and others. And I guess that's the concern for Peter Dutton, because preferences for him, they will be key. And he has to perform, as I say, with the speech of his life on Thursday night.
Yeah, Peter, and look, I think with the coalition, and you've done this on election nights, if I don't see a coalition MP with 43% of the primary vote when we're counting each individual electorate, they can quite often fall short. So absolutely the coalition's got to get a 4 in front of it if it wants to win that election in its own right. And if you look at the margin of error, you could say that nothing much has changed since the last election, that Labor could be on 33 and the coalition could be on 37. So we shall see. And yes, Peter Dutton does need to define himself a whole lot better than he has to date. I think if you asked most people what the coalition's policy alternative was, they would know about nuclear and pretty much nothing else. I agree with you on the idea that net zero would be a good thing to ditch, but I don't think that case has been made. And it needed to be made over the course of the last couple of years. And I think in some ways the coalition got the cart before the horse with nuclear. Absolutely, in the long run, that's something that needed to be done. But they needed to spend every single day with every single member hammering away at that $275 and letting people know that it's the policies of this government that's pushing up that bill, and that every time the government gives you a subsidy, that is a sign of abject policy failure. And that anyone who comes out and says that power prices have dropped by 25% in the last year is telling a lie. What's happened is that electricity prices have been subsidised, not just by the federal government, but by state governments. So I think with Peter Dutton, the problem is, if he wanted to make a dramatic move, it's probably too late to do that.
Let's get into the news poll numbers there. In macro terms, Dennis, the headline numbers still read, as I say, minority government with the Greens. Little or no chance the PM can command a majority. Now, Labor would say they've had a better couple of weeks than they have in recent months. I think I'd probably agree with that. Some would say the coalition's momentum has stalled. That's the sense, unfortunately, that I feel out there in the electorate. But that's not yet reflected in your numbers today, is it?
No, Peter, but I think it has been clear there's been a lack of discipline within the coalition. They've felt the pressure from Anthony Albanese about producing policy, and some of their economic policy has been, well, non-existent. So I think they have had a pretty poor 3 weeks. And the numbers in the news poll today, this is not a poll taken over the weekend. This was a compilation of the polls over the last 3 months. So a lot of that stuff that occurred in the last few days wouldn't be showing up in these polls. But having said that, there is no doubt that while the coalition hasn't had a particularly good time, Labor has also lost support. But the key here for Labor is that if the coalition loses a bit of support here or there, then the Labor Party has not been picking it up. So just more indication that more support going to the Greens and a higher likelihood of a minority government. It really depends where the support falls for the coalition.
What worries me, Chris, with the point you made there before, that it's too late, you think, for Peter Dutton to have a big offering, a big ask for the electorate. And I probably would agree with you, but I think that they can certainly do more than they have to date. What worries me, if the message has not yet crystallised, if his narrative is not clear, well, let's say the PM does call it this weekend, people will be pre-polling just 3 weeks after the weekend. You know, like it's almost imminent that Australians will be voting. So if the coalition's offering is as nebulous as you think, then it's almost impossible for them to win a majority if it's that bleak.
Yeah, look, and I think that it's the old John Howard saying, right, you can't fatten the pig on market day, and I do wonder that the coalition has not done enough work on policies in order to make the offering. And I was talking specifically about net zero. If you want to make as big a change as that, and you've got to try and pick up Teals and you've got to try and pick up the regional areas, you needed to make that statement some time ago. So if the coalition has got something to say, something real to say on cost of living. But the real issue here, Peter, is that we've now basically essentially got the Australian public addicted to government handouts. And you can see that in the fact that the coalition is just covering off on that. Now, it's not this election, it might not be the next election, but one day someone's going to have to make very, very difficult decisions and sell that to the Australian people. Someday someone will have to, because we simply do not have to have the cash left to continue to buy off the electorate in the way that we're doing it. These big programs like the NDIS and the other welfare programs, one day there will be a come to Jesus moment where we either cut them significantly or we basically go broke as a nation. So, you know, big decisions have to be made.
Chris, let me just jump in there.
The political class isn't making them.
We tried to make them. I was there when we tried to make them in 2014 on the back of Tony Shepherd's analysis about the state of the budget longer term. You know, the fact that there is so much baked in recurrent spending, so much of the budget is already given away to pensions and to payments and things, that unless you have a tough conversation with Australians and say, we're actually going to start taking things off you, right? That's a conversation people don't want to have. But unless we start taking things off Australians, we cannot sustain this level of spending. And I'll make the other point too. Once you take government benefits into account, so what people receive from the government, about 60% of Australians get back more from the government than they pay in tax. And the burden is borne by about 40% of people out there, 40% of taxpayers. Now, that's not sustainable.
No, and future generations, Peter, that's where the burden will be borne. And look, I just direct everybody to an article that was done recently by Chris Richardson, who is the budget guru in the Australian Financial Review, where he basically said this government has had a bigger unexpected windfall of cash, around about $400 billion by the time the next financial year is brought into it over the course of the government. That is the biggest windfall of unexpected cash in history. And what have they done? They've taken the size of government from 24.4% of GDP to 27.2% of GDP, a massive, massive increase in the size of government, which this country simply cannot bear in the long term. So yes, the circumstances for our fall have been set up, but who is the person who is going to have that hard conversation with Australians when 60% of them are getting government benefits?
You're not wrong. Let's talk about, let's talk about Labor's vote amongst women, Dennis. We talk a lot about the coalition. That's the view out there, that they're the ones with the problem in the female vote. But your news poll analysis says today, real issues for Labor, primary vote support amongst women and younger voters, having fallen steeply in the first 3 months of the year. Now, that, unfortunately, that level of support has swung largely towards the Greens, increases all our issues there with a hung Parliament. But, I mean, how material, Dennis, do you think this is? We saw in the US, it was talked about going into the polls, but it didn't materialise there on election day. And I think for the coalition, I think it's across all demographics, correct me if I'm wrong, across all demographics combined, the coalition's got a more favourable rating with women than Labor does. It's just this younger voter cohort. Labor's in trouble, coalition historically, yes, but Labor's in trouble now as well.
Yes, look, I think part of what we're seeing here, there was an overestimation of the impact of the women's vote in the US. There was also an emphasis on young men, particularly. They went the other way, as did blacks in the US. So, look, I think we see a lot of the polling beforehand. What you have to look at is what happens. In 1993, a late shift amongst women certainly defeated John Hewson over his Medicare changes, not so much the GST, but a female vote against changes to Medicare. I think what we've seen is a lack of family policy, that is, which concerns most women, coming from the coalition. The government has put up childcare and so forth. But I think that one thing that we're seeing here is a shift amongst older women towards the Greens. Now, it's not a large shift and it doesn't involve a large number of people, but we are seeing a greying of the Green vote. People who voted for the great Bob Brown when he was first elected to the Senate are entering their 50s. And a lot of those, that's the youngest, and a lot of those are much older. And what we're seeing is a radical older age, particularly amongst women who are supporting environmental issues. Now, they were once dismissed as the doctors' wives. I think there's still an element of that. But I think overall, the coalition has to make some big decisions. Jane Hume talking about changing the NDIS. This is a big matter for women, but it's also a huge matter for the budget. And if the coalition can turn around and say, there's one area which does affect women but affects everyone else, where we're actually going to do something to save money and ensure that families who need the most support get it from the NDIS, I think that would be a turning point for the coalition. But overall, I think by the time the election is called, whenever it is called, within a few days, the budget reply from Peter Dutton will be forgotten and we'll be moving into the most important phase and campaign we've seen for decades. The campaign will decide this election.
Yeah, I've said before, you know, campaigns don't often matter as much. This one will matter enormously. Just on something about framing of Peter Dutton. We saw the framing in relation to Mediscare, but let me just play you a grab from Simon Banks, a Labor insider today. Have a listen.
When Donald Trump's been doing things which have not been in Australia's national interest, Peter's constantly taken Donald Trump's side, made excuses for him rather than backed Australia. I think that's going to be a significant issue in this election campaign.
Just quickly, Chris, this is coming out of more and more Labor mouths in recent days. I think this is the next line of attack against Dutton, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this has been coming for some time, and they've seen what's happened in Canada, where the Liberal Party vote there has been revived by Donald Trump. Now, there's been a much more bare knuckle attack on Canada than there has been on Australia by Donald Trump. But the effect of that in Canada is to see people starting, and the Conservatives were going to win that in a canter before Donald Trump appeared on the scene. The Labor Party will absolutely, and so will the Greens and so will the Teals, try and tie Donald Trump up with Peter Dutton, because the truth of the matter is he is not as popular a figure here as he is in the United States, and he unsettles people. Like, I think some of that unsettling of the world is not a bad thing, but unsettling people in the lead up to an election may just have them cleave to the government that they know rather than experiment with one that they don't.
Thank you very much, gents. I look forward to your analysis all throughout the budget week.